Hello, everyone. I'm so grateful for who showed up tonight. It's with great appreciation I introduce someone that has been near and dear to Carol, or is still near and dear to Carol now. Ed Noonan was born in Butte. He first came to Carol with a group of Butte altar boys in 1962. In 1965, he attended a Catholic state speech and drama meet at Carroll, and for the first time, he performed on the Carroll stage. After graduation from Boys Central, he joined the Christian Brothers. He attended Lewis University, the University of San Francisco, and DePaul for his undergraduate degree. He taught high school in East Los Angeles and on the south side of Chicago. He received his graduate degree in speech with an emphasis in theater and film from Ball State University. He left the Christian Brothers and then moved to Helena. He participated in Carroll Theater from 1980 to 1986 until he started his job as a resident director here in March of 1986. He started as an adjunct faculty member in 1987. He has taught as one ever since, and including a full-time teaching job from 2000 to 2010. In 1989, he was involved in responding to the train blast, which left an ongoing lesson for not taking too much for granted. He became the Carroll Student Activity Director in 1990 and served for 10 school years. His work in those years has been honored in many ways, including the naming of the room that was the ASCC Center in the Cube after him. He went to the Myrna Lloyd Center in 2000 and served there for almost 15 years. He was on numerous national panels, grant panels, and boards during this period. He is currently a city commissioner for the city of Helena. For 2 years, he was a permanent part-time instructor until his position was suspended due to budget issues. He is a devoted Catholic man, and since he was a very young man, he has known that he was also a homosexual. I hereby give you Ed Noonan.
In that introduction, I clarify one thing. From 2000 to 2010, I did teach a full-time schedule as an adjunct, which was good because when I turned 60, I got a special benefit of health insurance whenever I needed it, and I did need it soon after that, so that was great. This talk, which started out as being a talk, and which it is, to the Gay-Straight Alliance here at Carroll College. It's been something that's simmered in my mind for a long time to share my experiences, especially as we know that in the 33 years I've been here, society and culture has changed a great deal. And a perspective on things when I started here, or when I was a young man prior to this, is a lot different. And one of the things that put me off on this route was last year in the city commission, we had the bathroom bill come up before to whether to add to our human rights ordinance whether bathrooms would be limited to people by the gender of their birth on their birth certificate. Well, so as we go through this, you'll see the approach I've had across my life about saying I was a homosexual, as was the case when I was younger, or gay, as that became the common parlance as I got older. But at the city commission meeting, I was candid about when I was a young man, my parents, families are never really too surprised, probably. I'm sure some are, but there's always a sense in some families of someone's sexual orientation, just like their intelligence or whatever. So my parents, I was the eldest of 6, and they weren't quite sure what to do. So we had as a family, met Ann Landers. The publisher of the Butte paper was the brother of the publisher of the paper in Iowa that she started at. So she came and she talked. So they bought her book that was called Ann Landers Talks to Teenagers About Sex. And there was a chapter in it on homosexuality, which I did go to immediately. And it opened up with the thought, and the chapter on the whole was very good. She was talking about it, and she had a lot of ideas, but it started out with, well, most people don't know homosexuals. The most common place is men in public restrooms might get a sense of that there's some strange interaction going on with other men. So that, I use that as the example that the idea that the bathroom was the arena for strange things going on is an old bias. And not necessarily, in all practicality, it's not necessarily the best arena for strange things going on. But we have a lot of literature about it, of course, and all that. So I said that, and so I was being rather candid and probably with other thoughts. And right after that, I got a slew of letters. Many of them were people who were supporters of Relevant Radio. Now, Relevant Radio provides a great access to the Catholic Broadcasting Network. But like all Catholic organizations, parishes and everything, there can be people who have different points of view that maybe sometimes should be challenged. In this case, it was a form letter with variations, and what it said was, I see you in church. How could you do that? Or you should stop going to church. Or it's ironic that you go to church. And I was like, okay, sir, okay, ma'am. You're absolutely wrong about that. And I did tell Monsignor O'Neill, just because he and I are friends, and that's not the church's opinion. But it did make me realize that, well, wait, that's out there. And one of the things in my time at Carroll, for a long time, and this was an ancient aspect of society, nobody talked about these things. But now things have come to the point where people do talk about them, and also for the majority of students, people at Carroll College, it is not even an issue. But I thought, especially speaking to young people in a gay-straight alliance here at Carroll, that it would be good to give my perspective on what that was saying to me and why it's wrong. As I got closer to this talk too, I wasn't really very nervous, but then the more people said, well, you're being very brave, then I started to get nervous. And it's not, what I'm going to share with you is my personal perspective based on the learning, the education that I've had. It's not an academic paper as much as it is my reflections on my own life and how it ties to a lot of things. Now, as a teacher and an educator, I've always had a very broad menu. So when I started out teaching in high school, I knew I wanted to be prepared to teach theater and speech and English, and later film came along. And so so I've always had a kind of a broad approach. And then because I was teaching in Catholic high schools, I also always taught religion, and did my studies in that at St. Mary's University as well as at Lewis University, St. Mary's College in Moraga. And then so here at Carroll, I've taught, I see the badge of honor, I've taught in a lot of different departments because the way I was trained, and I have a broad experience. I added business recently for teaching nonprofit fundraising. So it's like, okay, another department. So that's followed me all the way through. So I don't come to my thoughts without having an academic sense of where they're coming from. It's part of my examination of my conscience. To prepare myself to make the best decisions, I definitely want to think and learn as much as possible. So when we talk tonight, I'll be talking about a lot of various subjects, but I just wanted to do that. I'm going to approach this in 3 segments, although anybody who knows me, and there are people in here I've had for class, those segments might kind of merge or might go like this and come back eventually. But it's my development as a young person and how being a homosexual, because I don't think it was much later on past my adolescence when I ever really used the word gay. My thoughts on the Catholic Church is, that goes all through this, but also on a sense of where some of the current expressions of things have come from and where they're going. And then my experience here at Carroll in the various ways that I have. And I want to say right at the top, my experience at Carroll has been a good one. Doesn't mean that there aren't stories to tell too, though. And I've thought a lot about how I'm going to say these things, and I found myself being very cautious. For one thing, I have kind of a spontaneous speaking style, so I am being careful. I'll make fun of some of that in a minute, but so anyway, that's how this is going. That's where I start. So as a child, growing up in Butte, as a very young child, I remember having dreams. And this is where I'm going to be very careful. Wait till you hear the description of my dreams. As a very young child, I had dreams of running around in a field with handsome unclothed cowboys who had remarkable posteriors. I didn't quite understand what that meant, but I do remember the dreams. And I've always been a curious person, so I started to pursue this early. And for one, if you're paying attention, you do pick things up. You know, other people talk about in kind of very careful tones. And odd tension. So I started to pick up things. One of the good things was my parents were both educated, smart, modern people. And so I grew up in a household where the basic principle for me and my 5 siblings, my mother had 6 kids in 7 years, so that was a very Catholic approach to family making in the 50s. And from an early age, we all had the sense of we could be who we were. And that's a remarkable gift from parents. So I do remember picking up things like I had an uncle who was a deputy sheriff, and I picked up a book of his, and it went into crimes against youth by predatory men and the description of them, which was like, fairly shocking. So I had that, but I never really had a negative sense of myself in this, although I know it did create a certain uncertainty about, well, how does all this work out? Because what I basically felt, and I, from a very young age, had a strong spiritual bent, and was very prayerful throughout my life. And so I had the sense of God's love for me, but I also had to figure out this other aspect of things. So my sense of this grew, and of course we used to, in those days in Catholic school, you'd go in for a long time for examination of conscience prior to going to confession, and there would be like little blinking red lights around the sixth commandment. By the way, I hadn't thought of telling this, but it's a good story. When I was a Christian brother in Los Angeles, all dressed up, I went and tried out to be on a game show. And so I got on it. And so on national TV, it was called Split Second, and you only had a few seconds to give the answer. I don't remember how they asked the questions or that. And at the end, you'd win a car. That was the aim. So the question in the midst of it, I was out ahead, and the question in the midst of it was something like, what is the sixth commandment? Well, come on, thou shalt not commit adultery. And then I got buzz, I was wrong. And I said, no, that's not true, I'm right. So they said, we'll check on it. And at the thing, they realized I didn't know, of course, that the Protestant numeration of the Ten Commandments are different. The first commandment is, I am the Lord thy God. The second commandment is, thou shalt not put strange gods before me, which changes the numbering. Well, they didn't give me the points. They just disqualified the question, and I came in second. See, that was a total diversion. All right. And people, of course, there were tapes of it around for a long time, and students I had, everybody, because I turned beet red on TV when I thought I'd missed the commandment question. But I was lucky because as I started to ask questions about it, I ran into some really remarkable people. And that made all the difference. I wish that was available to everyone in the same time. But our parish priest was Father Aylward. He later would be the director of the psychology program here. He had just come back from the Jungian Institute where he got his doctorate degree. And he ran a practice out of the local hospital, and it was just down from the high school I went to, Boys Central. So as a sophomore, I went down to see him. And he was like, okay, well, let's sit down and talk about this. And he talked me through sexual development and the various potentials of where I might be at as a sophomore in high school. That some people, young people of the same sex being interested or possibly attracted can be part of that development and that passes. But a lot of times it isn't. And so he said, well, don't shut the door on anything right now. Just go out and see where you think you really are. So that was remarkably good advice. And there was no onus to it. Like, no, that can't be because that is sinful and wrong. It was not in that context. I didn't go to him, in a sense I did. He was speaking to me as a psychologist, but as a priest. Later on, when I went to when I went to enter the brothers, I was always candid about this with people. So I had to go through a psychological test, and so who gave it? Father Aylward over here at Carroll came over. And I talked to him about it, and he said, well, you know, it had not created, you know, there was no erratic behavior in my life. And he said, I know where you were, and I trust your own development. So I proceeded with that as good advice too. So I had that. I do remember one time bringing it up in confession, and I think it was like Holy Week, and the priest was not prepared for a discussion of it, and it went on forever. I just remember coming out of the confessional and all these people in line for Holy Week confession staring at me like, what could that have been about? So that was good. And so in high school I dated, but that was very, I liked to go to social events. I was proud I never missed a formal dance. I was involved in, activities. As a sophomore in high school, our parish council ran the biggest dance of the year. I was the president as a sophomore. So that's where the action was in terms of everything going on. So I always went, always had a date. I know that must have been a fairly disappointing experience for most of the dates. As I was kind of I did write a poem about that because for my junior and senior prom, I went with this young woman named Lillian, and it was a friendly relationship, and I have to be honest, it was the easiest thing for me, to go on a date with her. She would later get married and have a kid, but soon after that, she also discovered her sexual preference, and so was very active in it. I met her years later. A couple years ago, she died of cancer, and before she died, I wrote this poem for her. Two homosexual teens. They weren't yet gay or lesbian. It was the 1960s in Butte, Montana, where no structures were built for them to have a closet to hide in. They just couldn't be who they were. They could pretend to live the life as someone else, an option the Irish always found to be a good alternative to reality. Two homosexual teens found a simple attraction and unspoken common recognition and went to several proms together where overdressed they danced with passions hidden. Step and step in time. Now 50 years advanced, where they get to be who they are after momentous choreography, let them step and step in time, stripping down for everyone to see a simple fact. Look, we are naked, we are free. To me, the vivid image of all this is so much was held in darkness. The more I learned about the 1950s, which were my basic childhood in the early 60s, is everything was held in darkness and could not really be looked at. An incredible amount of pain and odd structures grew out of that. It's like when things are held in darkness, you're not sure what's going to come out of the darkness. But over time, those things, like the prophet Isaiah, that were held in darkness have been brought into the light. And that to me is the wonderful events of my time as a human being to see that happen. Yes, I can get emotional a little bit. So high school was good, and there was I did, friends I had in 8th grade, there was a sense of all this, and I lost them. You know, I wasn't going to be somebody people could hang out with, and there's a lot of reasons for those kind of things. But after a while, you know, some of that came back. But it was all of this unspoken sense of, and really, you know, if a lot of adolescent behavior is associated with just considering and talking about sex, that makes a big difference in terms of just how much you're bringing to the conversation. So then at the same time, my spiritual life had always been developing, and I had a sense of that. Being called, I had a really strong image at a basketball game. I played in the band, and the sense of the mystical body of Christ, of all the parts of every human being making up that body of Christ. I didn't know really how much that would be like my favorite theologian, Chardin, who I'd encounter soon after. The sense of that we make up the body of Christ, and that's what we're moving towards. That's what we have the capacity to become. But I did have a sense of all that, and so I joined the brothers. I was candid. I mean, it wasn't like I've got this dark secret. No. At that point, I could say, well, I am a homosexual, and I've had spiritual guidance, and I know that was very unusual. That was not something that, and I know one of the reasons was the reaction, like, oh, okay, now we'll go over here. And so this went on, and then I had a really good opportunity in my novitiate to see a counselor not connected to the church, but again, who talked me through a lot of the psychological aspects of this, and how so much of it is tied to how you deal with it and the choices of actions you make and all of that. And of course, this was, I started college in '67, and my novitiate was in San Francisco, so in 1968. So, and we no longer just stayed in the novitiate grounds, we were off experiencing life in San Francisco in those days. So the whole burst. Oh, and one thing I have to say is that when I was in 8th grade, the Vatican Council ended. And we embraced it here in Montana. Bishop Hunthausen went. When he came back, he was around everywhere telling everybody about it, teaching about it. Things changed dramatically. I was surprised that they hadn't changed as dramatically in other places as I went on, but so there was a great sense of that. So in that, this is where we slip from my experience in the church, but let me go with my experience a bit. So in college, it definitely was a little more of an apparent subject, and I went to college with a lot of people who were going to be brothers. That was going to change dramatically within the few years there. I came in at the era where religious orders had built big, gigantic places where young people were going to be trained, and then suddenly there was nobody to be trained in them. But in that, there was, and this is the touchy, amazing, so human thing about sexuality, is that there was a new optimism and a sense of, well, no, it's not something we need to try to control intensity or push down. It's something that we have to open up to and be honest about. And that may seem somewhat a little more obvious now, but that was pretty like, what? At that point, because sexual attraction has been the one of the biggest aspects of being human, and it just doesn't always work out right. And we know that because we have literature and we have opera and we have the stories over and over again of how the power of sexual attraction can go incredibly wrong. And so it's easy to be optimistic, but on the other hand, it's realistic to go, wow, this can be problematic. And so therefore needs a tight hand, a watchdog or whatever, and the church, and not only the church, but just about every group in society has tried to, in so many bizarre ways, things you'd see on the History Channel, how do you subvert that sexual attraction? And we know it's just like, and we know that hardly, it doesn't, just like it's so easy to make a mistake with sexual attraction, it's also pretty hard to not have it be anywhere around, because it's such a part of being human. So I remember reading St. Francis's quote when he died. He was a soldier in his youth and a handsome young man, and it's when a little bit older that he comes back and receives the Spirit to go off on this great adventure of his life. But he did a lot of really rough things to his body to subvert sexual attraction. And as a man just before dying, he said, I wish I would have treated brother body better. And that stayed with me. So in all of this, I'm not underestimating what this means. And I think that's a part of caution you'd find with any, especially a church. Like, well, okay, here we go down the road, and we know there's lots of problems here. And we also know, and that's the thing, is that we know of the fallibility in all directions that comes from human beings, even those human beings who have the best intentions. So I went forward with optimism, and really in my time in the Brothers, it was something that I could choose fairly reasonably to not be afraid of what I was, to have been open about it, and to have not gotten myself in the secretive kind of behaviors that we know so often have plagued groups. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute too. So, and one of the things that I know I took hope from was knowing the Vatican II documents. And in them, one of them, and I was taught it various ways because it right away was debated what it meant. But in the document Gaudium et Spes, which is joy and hope, it introduces, or it states about the inherent right we all have as human beings to the life of God that speaks to us directly. And in that, it is our right, our responsibility, and it's expressed in the term the primacy of conscience. That we in our conscience must respond to that in the way that we see right as being right. Now, like so many things in Vatican II, it's like, well, yes, that was said, but we know a lot, and it's really, you got to do what the church says. Now, that was one interpretation. But on the other hand, a lot of it was turn people to it. Now, this, and I have to be careful about time here, but I'll sense when you've had too much, I think, and I got to get to Carol. But let me just, here's a quick thing. In the 19th century, it was clear to the church that organizations, businesses, countries were trying to use their power to get people to do what they wanted them to do. And out of this grows Pope Leo XIII's doctrines of social justice. That in the end it's not the worker to be the servant of the employer, of capitalism. In the end, there has to be a conscious decision of choosing what is right. This argument of what that meant was started out in that way. And it was accelerated in the early part of the 20th century with Hitler's rise in Germany. Because Hitler did try right away to get the Catholic Church to do what he wanted. And when it was clear that the Catholic Church as an universal church, as an international church, that was hard. To force the Catholic Church within the country to do what he wanted, and especially in the subservient of those aspects, those people of the society he didn't like. And it's a complicated thing. There's lots of stories. Pope Pius XII was caught in the middle of it. There's the terrible story by in the biography of, oh my God, I can't remember it, but I mean, who's the great Protestant theologian who died in what? Bonhoeffer. Of the description of all these Jewish people took shelter in the Vatican, and the Pope had the choice to let that happen and then to lose at the Vatican, as Mussolini and Hitler, to lose all political control and probably the Vatican. And so he told them to leave. You know, there's a lot in that decision, but it was very hard, problematic. And at the heart of it, though, was that the church was saying, no, in conscience, this is what should happen, and that people should stand against this. And after World War II, that that idea just flourished, especially as people became aware of the Holocaust and all of the things. That people had turned over their will. You know, all kinds of people wanted to say, I just did what I was told. And that did not hold any, that did not hold water. So as the church moves to Vatican II, this idea of the primacy of conscience is strengthened. And so there it is. It's in Gaudium et Spes, and I know people could sit down and discuss, how does it fit in the hierarchy of things within that. But it was there. And right after Vatican II, it got translated in another way and in an unexpected way. That, wait, in conscience, perhaps people had the right to make choices about their own sexuality. And that was like, well, no, especially not that. And I don't mean to belittle that, but there was a kind of, oh my God, we didn't think this was going that way. But right away it happened with the question of birth control. And the educated Catholic populace, especially after Vatican II, said, well, look, in conscience, I think I can use birth control. And that became a big problem. And it's gone on. In the years, as Father Sullivan, our historian and author of our mission, said, it was going to take 50 years for Vatican II and the turmoil of it to kind of settle down. And it did. And with Pope Francis, we see, it may not necessarily be a settling, but we see a kind of something else emerging, which is deeply tied to the teaching of Vatican II. And so recently, in a lot of theological circles, he got himself in trouble with a teaching. It wasn't really an encyclical, I don't think, but which translates as the joy of loving. And in it, what he does, which he had said from the beginning, he presented the role of the priest of the church as advisor, especially in those situations where people come in to talk about those things so closely tied to family and to sacrament, baptism, marriage, and that it is the role of the church not to necessarily provide this is what is right, but to illuminate the conscience of the people involved so that they can operate in the fullest way in that which he spells out is this God-given gift in conscience to make a choice about, well, I'm not going to stay married to that person. That person brutalized me. And so I'm not going to do it. You know, all of the personal things that we can see in that are not so easily covered by you do it this way. And that set off, because what it did, it really did open up the whole question of what about sexual preference. Now, the church has not changed its teaching on same-sex marriage, and it really has not changed its teaching, but what Francis has called to is a change of approach. And I read an article recently where a conservative priest said, this is what happened. I went to a Catholic conference and there was a young gay, lesbian, bisexual spokesperson, transgender spokesperson who said, oh no, the Pope is saying we have a right in our own conscience to decide these things. And that's the church is struggling with that still. But it's in that I, a long time ago, bought into Gaudium et Spes. And I made a choice that within the structure and the knowledge and the education I've had, I could make my own choice. Now, in my case, for a lot of reasons, I have never been in an extended relationship with another man. And that's because I did take a vow. I took a vow of celibacy. I was later relinquished from that, a vow of chastity. But in that, I sincerely said I would give my life to help other people. And even though I was relinquished from it, it did have a hold on it. It's not that I didn't leave myself open, and sometimes probably had to be held by the back of my coat from rushing into something. But that's just the way my life went. But I didn't carry around I wasn't doing it out of a sense of sinfulness or anything like that. So that would be a whole nother debate. But that's why when somebody tells me I shouldn't be in church, they don't know what they're talking about. In the fullness of my conscience, I'm myself, here I am, and I just so happen to be gay also. And I am deeply devoted to the Eucharist. And those people cannot stand, nor would the church stand between me and the sacraments. And we know that's an imperfect thing. We've seen some examples. There was a struggle in Montana recently, and you hate to see that. Because in one way, sexuality is a private thing. And for me to be talking about all this is like, well, I don't really, I don't do this. It was, I wrote a poem even at one time going, I don't care what kind of sex you're having. I can't find the poem. But it was true. It's like, and really we don't, as much as we're susceptible in some ways, everybody has their own private relationships. And we know that on the whole, there's a lot of beauty and goodness, and it's like that speak to other people. One thing, I learned this as a kid. My mother and father did not see eye to eye. I was the eldest. I got caught in the middle of their conversations. Later on, I learned, what the heck, why was I being in the middle of that? These two people loved each other, and they proved it. My mother died on my father's birthday. My father thought that was a touching, romantic thing. So he died on his birthday too. And it was at that point that it was like, well, really, why was I trying to figure out their relationship? It was beyond me. All right, so anyway, I leave the brothers. I came with two good friends to Helena. We were doing theater. We did it all over the place. We still do. And at that point, my mother died. And so in this period, a little bit ahead of that, and especially accelerated, my mother died, I went through what the studies, this is convenient when you find these things to explain yourself, delayed adolescent development. And I read about it in an article about the University of San Francisco in the summer of 1969. And I happened to be going to school there, a bunch of us, young brothers. We went there we had, it's a Jesuit college. We had some great classes. Also, it was right next to Golden Gate Park in the summer of 1969. At least you could go look, right? Well, look at it. Look what all those people are doing. But all these older religious were acting absolutely crazy. And even at that point, I could tell they're acting like teenagers. There was just this sense of teenage and adolescent behavior going on. So it turns out a study was done about that summer. And what all these people went through and where they ended up. It was at that point that, all these people who had joined religious orders prior to Vatican II and were under the sense of control, when all that opened up, they started to look at different options. And we know it was a great exodus. And at the time, it seemed like, in some ways, a terrible thing, but people went off and got married, and on the whole, and they still ended up serving the church often or whatever. It wasn't adjustment by this change of how you look at these things. So I see myself that when I first moved to Helena, I went through this delayed adolescent. I had a little bit to catch up with. And I'd say it, a little bit embarrassed. It was because I just went around saying kind of openly that I was gay. And seeing where that took me. Well, it got me beat up twice. And it was adolescent often in its expression. So I think getting beat up kind of took me out of it. Also, I think it was in my grief, grief when a parent dies or someone, it reverberates throughout, and often it does. There's, you can look that up about the impact it has on a person. But also, in the midst of it, suddenly I remember the day when somebody said, well, did you hear about this gay cancer? And the world changed. because coming out of the 70s into the 80s, you know what happened back in 1910, 1920, birth control changed the way people looked at sexuality. I teach this in history of film because film got so, became the symbol of this change, but it was because of birth control. And so things accelerated, and suddenly there was this openness about, well, bisexuality, and then in the midst of it, and again, you can look up the studies, the 70s became a big period of experimentation. But then suddenly that door slammed with the arrival of AIDS in the 1980s. And it did give everybody if I had lived a different life, and at some point, I remember when I was in college, I thought about, well, maybe I should just go to school in Chicago and learn about life, not in a religious order, that. And this one guy said, oh, well, I'd hate to see you go that route. I've been there, and I'm not sure what I think about it. But if I would have made another choice, I don't think I would have be here tonight. I feel a lot of what I was able to do symbolically is sail through the wreckage of the Titanic. Now that's kind of a familial image because my grandmother, Winifred Nolan, and her sister, Sarah, sailed, and my aunt always said, they had cabins. They weren't in steerage or anything. They sailed in the ship from Ireland, but they sailed through parts of the wreckage of the Titanic. And throughout this whole period, for me to be here with the sense of myself and all of this, whoa. So at that point, and there's some people here I worked with a little bit towards the end of that period, but that all brought me back down to a pretty solid ground. And then I got a job at Carroll. And it was purely by accident. And one of the things was that the woman who hired me did not know that I was from Butte. She thought I was from Chicago. She hated Butte people because Carroll was filled with them. And when she hired me, it was like a month later talking to in those days we called them RAs, residence assistants, now they're community assistants. And I was an RD, which is now something else. But I said, I'm from Butte, and she went, what? You're from Butte? I would never have hired you. So that's how definite that was. And she wasn't kidding. So there's two levels here. For one, it was, how the unspoken perception. So I was coming in, and I came into the dorms at a very terrible time. There's no two ways about it. There's some people here who were in Carroll at those days. But that's because of alcohol. Alcohol was everywhere. It permeated it because the legal age was 19. It had been 18 just a couple of years before that, which meant that everybody could drink from the minute they got here. How long does it take for the freshman class to turn 19? Not that long. And so the 19-year-olds a lot of them arrived that way, and so alcohol was everywhere. And we had the craziest set of rules. Jim probably saw it in other places, and probably knows, but you couldn't have more than 14 people in your room when you had a keg party. Uh-oh.
Those were the days,
Yeah. And so that didn't mean that you couldn't have 3 keg parties next to each other. And really it was true. I'd go in and they'd be so proud when they'd say, there's only 14 of us in here. Okay, all right, fine, I'll close the door, be a little quieter. And everybody had elaborate bars, and of course they bought the best alcohol, and we had to go around, and I don't know if they still do, but we had to go around and unplug things on the breaks. Another little diversion story. One time I unplugged it, and then a whole floor was stunk up as somebody was storing their deer that they had shot. And over Christmas vacation, the refrigerator had been unplugged. Why? Why did you do that? Well, that's probably a good question. So the alcohol was everywhere, and we didn't have a student activity director at that time, and I pretty much was on the front line of it all the time. And it was, because people had a right to drink. They could be standing there, ha, ha, ha. I had to respond to their behavior in other ways. And softball weekend, which everybody, and this was true at the time, everybody carried around pony kegs. So alcohol it created all kinds of disruptive behavior, destruction. It was not good. And I was the one who was kind of put there to enforce it. And I was only here a month when a kid died on softball weekend. So I felt the need to try, it was because he had drank all day. He got mad, his friends got in the car and went out in the valley and where the roads kind of wind, and he went straight and killed himself. And I was in identifying his body. So I felt that, it was like I had to do this. But there was a perception, I don't know, I know that some people would put the term fag or something like that on it. And the thing about that is that that's okay, because I'm from Butte, nothing better than if they underestimate you. And so then you can respond and it'll take them by surprise. So I did respond, and then I had the years where it turned from 19 to 21. So I had 2 years there where I was taking away their birthright. They should be able to drink, their friends over there could. And we had alcohol everywhere. There wasn't a dance that didn't have, and money was made, selling beers at a dance down in the, so things were in bad shape. And so I did, but not too much. I did get pushback. And occasionally I'd hear something, or it would be at the other end of the corridor, that kind of thing. Or see something, or but I eventually got through it. I was glad to let it go at the end of that, but I didn't feel any problem or issue there too much beyond the fact, and I think this was, how often was this true? The perception, the unspoken perception about where people are sexually. And most people kind of do that, but if somebody wants to get worked up about it, they could. And if somebody really had a grudge against me, which some people did, they could a little bit. But it never reared its ugly head in any way I could say was really bad. And there was also the awareness of, so sexual activity among people in college age, again, that may well be going on. And, and there'd be, at least I had enough awareness I remember 2 guys who were kind of working themselves up to something, but in the dorms, I was doing I had to always about 2 o'clock go around, make sure and they were so loud, and it was tell that one guy was trying to seduce the other guy who seemed open to it. And I knocked on the door and said, well, whatever's going on in here, you may want to be a little more quiet. I mean, so there was all, that sense, but that didn't. And in the midst of this one time, and I always have laughed, I came down to the bathroom down the road here, and on one of the stalls, it said, Ed Noonan is gay. So I was like, well, yeah. Okay. So I think there was always a perception there, although people didn't really talk about it that much. And I had to go through the struggle, especially in the classroom, because there were people who'd say, well, you should tell people. And I was like, no, I don't know that I have to tell them. Of course, and that was in a period of time where, no, we need everybody to be open and out of the closet and that. And it's like, well, I'm not really in the closet, but I don't know that what if I go in to teach a communication class or some other class, that the first thing I say is hello and this and this and this, and I'm gay, and what context is there for that? And it can be misunderstood or whatever. So over time, though, I've just figured people may pretty well go, yeah, I think he is gay. But, it isn't. And if somebody asked me, I'd say yes. Hardly anybody ever asks. But in that underground thing, there were times when the ugliness showed itself, where people did get beaten up by others and did not want to have anything said because they were way too embarrassed, because they did not want it to come out that they were beaten up because in some ways, some people, even friends, perceived that they were gay. And so, that was, it's a lot like the struggle the church went through and so many other organizations. There's a tendency to ignore it. And so in the background, things are going on and you hear about them, but you don't really focus on them. You don't pay a lot of attention to them, hoping that they stay kind of over there. And we know that this really turned out to be problematic for the church in the last 30 years. And we know, I can speak about it across my whole experience with Catholic institutions that, yeah, there was always an unspoken problem or an unspoken awareness that was never dealt with in various ways. And often it was about men and sexuality with other men. It wasn't always, it could well have been heterosexual sex, or even faculty who had improper relationships, a man with a woman student. It took a lot for those things to really be brought into focus. But we know, there's been a lot of public attention about, yeah, this was going on. And it was going on all over the place. And there was it's the mistaken attitude of a person can change, the idea of redemption and the sacrament of reconciliation. However, that seemed to some people just be a kind of a get out of jail free card. And so the behavior followed around, and it wasn't dealt with in a healthy way, or a practical way. So that was going on. I had incidents of various kinds of sexual behavior between faculty and students that I did report. And it was really only much later on that I ever heard anything back or anything was done. And it was all in that, what we know now in the Me Too movement, the protectiveness of, well, did the student come forth and say it? No, I said, the student told me, and I'm telling you. So that invalidated it. And yet, when you report that a couple of times, you think that might add up, but it didn't. And this was not unusual. And it wasn't just not unusual in Catholic institutions or anything. It was not unusual just about every public kind of institution we had, and we're only recently become very aware of that. So yeah, that was going on. I mean, there were incidents of that, and those were problematic, and things were held in darkness. But it's just as I ended my 10 years as a student activity director that there was a period where things really accelerated. And so some of it I know when I was in student life, and so therefore more familiar with it. I'm not going into the details or anything. And some of it is what I know about it later on when I was teaching and working at the Myrna Loy. But there was first, when I was still here, there was an incident of somebody getting beaten up, and he did want to pursue it. It was handled somewhat openly, and the press picked it up. But it wasn't really extensive coverage, but it was picked up and it kind of disappeared. Yeah, things were responded to, and then it was quiet. Then there was a silly thing. There was a picture in the Prospector of some kids making fun of somebody they didn't like. And they said, it's a bunch of guys acting funny, and they say, he likes to go down to Guad to get his toenails painted. Well, that got picked up by the national press. Like, we had this little thing, now here it is again. Carroll College is allowing them to make fun of gay people. It had nothing to do with that in that case. I mean, that's the example of, oh my gosh, these things can get so crazy. It was not about that at all. It was guys making fun of another guy. Maybe there was an edge to that, and they were definitely saying, no, there wasn't. But everybody got all the cards were put on the table, but it wasn't like this was treated like. But then, just after I left, a young man was beaten up. And it's that idea of, and I'm saying, I'm telling you what, it's a little bit of hearsay, and I'm not gonna, because of that, I'm not gonna go too much into it, but the idea as he expressed it, or was expressed in the newspaper, was he asked someone to go on a date. And then somehow there was drinking involved, and in the drinking got beat up, and he was painted. And he says he reported it and that nothing was done. Then his parents got involved. And again, there was a lot of attention. And at that time I was teaching Alpha Seminar, and so not totally directly, but indirectly, we took on the idea of, well, let's do some education about this. It was also at the same time that Matthew Shepard was killed in Wyoming. So that was good. So we did try to address it in Alpha Seminar. And that was the first time that I could remember that we kind of openly looked at this, talked about it. And people did it with a lot of hesitation, because it's like, are we going to upset the church? And, well, having compassion for someone and treating people right, there's no question of what the church is going to say about that. at that point. So at that point, I thought maybe I should be a little bit more open about being gay. And I had done this before, so I tried it, not necessarily with students, but with alumni and say, well, I'm gay, and it's important for me to say that. And after a while, that wears out because a lot of times it's fine, but other times it isn't. It's just the relationship has changed. There wasn't a question of that they thought it had anything to do with an overture. It's just, it's changed. It changed. So it's like that was a little tiring. But again, it was in that thing like, well, I've told people the word, I let the word get out. But I did write in those days an article for Alpha, which I said people could put my name on or not, and that I read in the class. I didn't say this is me, but it was called Why I'm Gay and Catholic. I'm just going to read a little bit of it. The long intellectual heritage of the Catholic Church and its tradition appealed to me and captured my imagination at an early age. The worldview captured in the teachings of the Catholic Church gave me an imaginative approach, an intuitive way to how to see myself in the world. My father was a skeptic, well-versed in the sins across history of the human church hierarchy. We had all the books about the bad popes and its failure to recognize the truth. Sins that were often tied to the need to assert and sustain old habits of power. Across my life, my father's skepticism has been a guide for me to separate the chaff from the wheat, the human failure from the powerful sustaining reality of the church's sacramental life. This sacramental life and the spirituality it engenders has been a guide for me across my life, allowing me to move into the light out of the dark shadows that historically gay men and women have had to live. The church taught a way of spirituality that has been simplified across time into a clear and accurate spiritual approach. In the sacrament of the Eucharist, I found a truth, a life that I've continually examined through prayer and scripture and hopeful commitment to good work. The life and examination has led me as an individual down my own path and has allowed me to embrace the beauty of my sexual preference in the light of God's loving acceptance of me. This examination, which includes a study of the Church's teaching on sexuality, has shown me how to integrate the Catholic tradition in a peaceful relationship with my sexual nature. That has only happened by knowing that I needed to separate out a large pile of intellectual and arrogant dross. By doing this, I was able to let the light shine on the Church's teaching of authority and its relationship to human conscience that were so accurately expressed in the documents of Vatican II. Now that's my own personal statement of faith. And I do take joy in where Pope Francis follows up on that. But at that point, when we did that, there was a kind of reaction. People didn't necessarily want to talk about them, really uncomfortable. Within a short time, the audience had changed, of course, and they were in a different place. The very existence of the GSA is an example of that. It's like, well, no, this is not a dark secret. And especially if you're fall into some of these categories at a Catholic institution, you should be hiding as much as you can. I know that young people coming and going through their development who come here do feel that often. But more and more they've met a sense of, no, this is a safe place for you to learn and to be guided to a sense of your true self. And that is great. To me, we go up and down. We've been going through a budget crisis. There's, things are, there's always problems. But underneath it, the thing that I've seen over and over again and really know to be true is that the true spirit and heart of Carroll is passed on from the students to the students. And over a period of time here, those people who are hard-headed or they get they get guidance to not be so hard-headed, not from an authority, but from their friends. And people who need to be more open. And of course, that's part of, that's part of of that developmental stage of moving away from the isolation of your own opinion and authority to the intimacy of integrating other people. Some of that delayed adolescence that I had to find a little bit after, because as Eric Erickson's steps, those development steps, you got to go through them. And the Carroll students are the ones who are the watchtower, or the lights, the image from the Song of people with lights going through the village, announcing, here comes the truth of love. And that happens, and so I'm glad to do this tonight, to participate in that. Not that I haven't, but in some ways to celebrate it, because as I said at the beginning, this was not a bad story. It's got problems in it, and that's what human sexual life has. But there has been something, and this is Carol's great gift, to keep it moving forward. In the late 1990s, for 5 years we did on St. Lucy Mass, that's the Festival of Lights, we lit candles up in front of St. Charles. And we kept adding them. And so that on the Christmas of 1999, Lucy's Mass, the Festival of Lights 1999, we were there to greet the 20th century as a light on the hilltop. And so that's, to me, that is what Carol is. And those things that were held in darkness have been brought into a wonderful light. Spoke way too long, but I could take a couple questions if anybody. I also, of course, I'm always have to blow my nose. My classes get used to that, yeah.
You said the AIDS epidemic helped you get through your adolescent behavior. If there hadn't been an AIDS epidemic, would you have gotten through it, or?
Well, I don't know. I guess, there's another story I can tell there. I became involved in the AIDS hotline and the Lewis and Clark AIDS Project, and just tried to help people deal with this reality. And it was something we didn't know that much about, too, that it was going on in the community and the way it was touching people's lives. And so in that case, I really do think that there were so many junctures where I could end it up in a not healthy place. With a lot of humility, I admit that. And my nickname is Edge, which means I can get right to the edge and not quite go over. And people have recognized that in me. I'm curious, so I don't mind looking over the edge sometimes. I'm talking too much. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
First of all, I want to say thank you so much for sharing and all the love that you've poured out for Carol for 33 years. It's a life that you've given here, and that's really wonderful. I wouldn't be following my conscience if I didn't also say that I think that some of the things you said tonight are really incomplete, especially about the church, not about your experience. That's yours. I think it's great to hear that and to learn from that, but especially about conscience apart from the teachings of the church. Like, conscience is not just absolutized by the Catholic Church. right? It's always done in conversation with the moral teachings of the church. And there's documents about that, because there was need for that after Vatican Council. And I guess I'd ask you, the question would be, just as the people at the cathedral who might have said, you don't belong here, have a very incomplete understanding, do you worry that some of the people walking away from here could have a very incomplete understanding of what the church actually teaches if that's not entered into more fully and completely?
Well, I did try to say, and I would emphasize it here, that some of the things I am seeing in this development are very much in debate. And the discussion around the Pope's teaching on joy of loving is a good example. You know, there are people who called him to heresy because of it. And I hope I didn't say that there was an answer separate from the teaching of the church. There was an answers that within conscience you still can operate within that. And I know that that's the whole question of what does the primacy of conscience mean.
And what does the formation of conscience look like within a Catholic context?
Right.
And not everybody here is Catholic. I just want to make sure that the churches and the teachings of the church are accurately represented if this dialogue is to go forward, really. And maybe it's better to sit
Well,
down
no,
and have lunch with you.
I'm glad you said it because I don't want to leave that impression. I wasn't speaking for the church. I was speaking from my own long development of conscience within the dialogue of the church. And, you know, here I stand, I'm in line with the church. You know, that's part of what to say to those people. I mean, like those people I can have not fully understand in the broad discussion of the church where it's headed, but I have not operated outside of that.
Thank you. And I'm not trying to attack.
No, and we're
I
not.
just wanna have a conversation.
Yeah.
I'd love to have lunch with you too.
Yeah. Sounds good. No, I didn't take it at all, Father. And that's, you know, that's the only part of trepidation I have is that, yeah, this is where I'm at, but it's still a big debate, and where Pope Francis is going to end up with it is in question, or where the church will be in response to all that. Anybody else? All right then, well, thank you for coming, and